Good answer. Good answer, Lou. Yes, we are terrible at languages. We do double Dutch. Okay. Do you know what double Dutch is?
Nope.
What I speak most of the time.
Yeah.
Stephanie.
Yes.
You've got about 4 languages, haven't you? What I speak.
3 fluent and 3 or 4 sort of smatterings.
Right. So where are you based, Stephanie? Where do you live?
I'm just up the road from John. I'm John's partner.
Right. So that's Somerset.
No, Gloucester, Cirencester.
Cirencester. Oh, yeah. I know it well. My family all come from Gloucester.
Oh, right. Yeah, I was, Gloucester girl. So.
Right.
But Cirencester's nicer than Gloucester.
Here we go. Here's a question for you, John. You never asked this to Stephanie. Did you remember the Adam and Eve pub in Paradise?
No.
Do you remember? You know the village of Paradise?
Yes.
Yes. There was a pub there called the Adam and Eve. So you could go for a drink with Adam and Eve in Paradise.
Jilly Cooper wrote about it and claimed she didn't know the village existed.
I bet she didn't.
Right.
Well, she's just over in Birdlip.
Yeah.
Let's just hope we've got loads of people. Hello, Vivian. There's let's hope there's lots of people listening on other devices.
Right. Okay.
Because people will be listening without coming into the room. Oh,
right. Just can Lulio, can I play a whistle like I am at the moment? How would this sound?
Yeah.
That's fine.
It's
that
fine. When the noise is too loud, Zoom will cut it out, so we won't be able to hear you. So just blow it softly.
Okay. Right,
just like you were just then. That was okay just then. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Well, I haven't got me flutes or me, and I've got a nickel harper, John, nowadays. So.
Right. So.
Okay, hang on. I am listening, but I won't be in screenshot all the time because this is a big room and I'm sorting things out. But you're on high volume, so I can hear.
Okay.
Okay.
Hello,
Trudy.
Hello, Trudy.
Oh.
Right, Trudy's in Texas.
Oh, hello, Texas. Well, I've never been there. I've told stories with Texas storytellers in America.
So Vivian, I'm not sure where you are.
Yeah, I just have a picture showing because I don't look too hot today.
Okay. And Hussein, I'm not sure where you are, but we do have a little bit around the world today. So am I ready to start, Yulia? You're quite happy for me to announce Mike. Now we've all got to know each other. Right. And at the end, we can all pop into our virtual bar and you can all buy Mike a drink.
Absolutely. I'm well up for that.
By dropping something in the virtual hat. Did we get the virtual hat together? I said that weeks ago. Never mind.
Don't worry about it.
Don't worry. Anyway, the assembled company, both in the room and out.
Right.
Whether you're on Facebook, YouTube, on the World Storytelling Cafe, just watching without coming in the room, or whether you're actually in the room with us. It is, I've hung around loads of fields over my existence, and there are storytellers that pass through. And for several decades, I have been passing through Mike's fields, and Mike has been passing through the ones I'm in. And but Mike actually collects stories from, I think it's an excuse for sitting in lots of bars and talking to old boys. Well, that's what I find. And so it is with great pleasure. Can we put our hands together and welcome Mike Rust?
Oh.
Yay!
Good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here in front of you. And I'm going to start off by telling a story about coracles. Now, if for those of you who don't know what a coracle is, I've got a picture here. I don't know if you can quite see it, but it's a little sticky little boat that the Romans used to find when they came over, when Julius Caesar turned up. He writes in when he had a sort of, they call it the Chronicles nowadays, but what it was the regimental archive. And when they came to the River Severn, what he told everybody was that the natives there, and that's us, because I've just had my DNA done, so that would be my family, and they crossed the River Severn in little sticky boats. Now, what he meant by that was that it's woven together. So it's hazel or ash, and they're woven together. Now, the Welsh. Now, we talk about the Welsh. We're on the Welsh border here, or as sometimes we call it, the English border, or the Welsh March. They're over the other side there, along the Teifi and all those other rivers there. They're famous for the coracles, quite rightly so. And each coracle is shaped in a different way. So it's shaped to the design of the river. And so the coracles that we use on the upper Severn don't work particularly well down at the end of the Teifi as you go through Carmarthen. And their boats, as they come up here, they don't work particularly well because they're a bit smaller and they're built for the Teifi. But up here on the English side of the river, we've got the Severn and we've got the Dee and we've got the Avon and we've got the Usk. The Usk starts in England, but it goes into Wales. We've got our own coracles. And there is a story about the coracles that I'm going to start telling you tonight. Now, the coracles that we had up here, they're used for fishing and for poaching and all the other things that you do, because you can go up the river and you can go down the river and backwards and forwards. And sometimes you'd argue about who owned the river. Now, John, how do you work out who owns the river? Because if they own both the banks, do they own the water? Well, I don't know. I've got you muted, so I couldn't answer. I couldn't hear you, right? So what one of the coracle guys said, they turned round and they went and they said, and the Lord went, "You're on my water." And he turned round and he went, "Is it your water above the Cressidge Bridge?" Which is a bridge over the River Severn. And he went, "No." And he said, "Well, I'll sit here and wait for that water to come down, then I'll sit on that water." And the Lord of the Manor, well, he huffed and he chuffed. Well, down just as you come into the gorge, now you're at Iron Bridge now, basically. So you're south of Shrewsbury, but north of Bridge North. There's a little place called Jackfield. Now, Jack used to farm there because, well, see, the thing is, it's the worst farming in the whole of Shropshire because it's in a tight gorge. And so the sun only shines on one half of it for one half of the day. Then it shines on the other half of it for the other half of the day, instead of shining on all of it all day. So all his vegetables and all his crops were exactly half the size of everybody else's because he didn't have enough sunlight. He got plenty of water, but he didn't have enough sunlight. So in the afternoons, he used to get his little sticky boat out or get his little coracle out and off he go into the river. Now, on the fisher days, which is what they call the fisher seasons, is where the salmon were coming up, or when the trout were about and stuff like that. So he went out, and what you do is you'd make it, and it's about the size of a dinner table, and you'd sit there and you'd have a whole load of rope and a big boulder, and you'd weave the rope round the boulder and you'd just chuck that in the river and that would hold the coracle. You get your fishing rod out and you start fishing. You know what it's like when you go fishing. Some days you have good days, some days you have bad days. Other days you get nothing at all, and some days you get lots and lots and lots. Well, it was one of those days where he didn't get much at all. So he sat down there, and just as he was going half asleep, you're in the zone when you're sat there and you're quite relaxed and everything else. And he sat there, and he's not doing very much, and there's nothing much going on. And a voice from behind him said, "You're not catching much, are you?" And he nearly jumped out of his skin. And he turned round, and there he was. Now, the pesky devil turns up loads and loads of times. And if you ever see him, he's got two pointy ears. He's got a red face. He's got a tail that goes up and lands on his left shoulder there. And he dresses quite peculiarly. He really does. But he came round in his coracle. It's called the devil's coracle. And he turned round and he sat there and he said, "Well, what you caught?" And Jack, when he nearly sort of grabbed hold of his skin and went and sat back down inside of it, turned round and went, what are you doing here? He said, well, I'm fishing for souls. He said, souls? He said, yeah. He said, the River Severn, it always produces a couple of souls every year. Now, what happens is this. It happens to this day that sometimes people fall in the river and they don't come out of it again, and the devil scoops them up. And so from time to time, he goes up and down the River Severn. He's looking for souls, but he hadn't caught any that day. So he turned round and the sun was just going down. He said, you know, Jack, he said, you fancy a bit of a deal? Now, I don't know which part of the world you're in, but if you come across the devil and he's offering you a deal, always look in the small print. That's the thing. So get the contract out. He's always got a contract somewhere. And it said, we'll fish for a year every Saturday night from when the sun goes down, from when the sun goes up. You have all the fish and I have all the souls. Then underneath it said, and if I don't get any souls for 12 months, you have to come to hell instead. Well, Jack looked at it, got his reading glasses out, looked at it again. And he always was a bit of a cocky sod, whichever way you look at it. Well, he's bound to get a soul in the River Severn once a year, because it always happens. Somebody always falls in the river. They get drunk or they always get in the river. So anyway, he shook hands on it and the deal was struck. Well, that night, they got the two coracles out and they're both about the same size. And what you do is you put a net across the coracles. And you stand there. Now, if you're on the left-hand side, which is when I always go left when I'm doing this. So on this side, you're holding a net. And the net is the size of a small kitchen table, but round and circular. And you're holding there. And on the right-hand side, you've got your paddle. And you sit there and you're just holding yourself in the river. And you just sit there holding yourself in the river and the other guy's doing it the other way round. And then all the fish that come in stay in and all the souls that come in stay in. Well, that was the deal. So that night, as the sun came up, it was about this time of year, 4 o'clock in the morning, they looked in the net. There was lots of fish in there, but there was no souls. And the devil turned around and said, that's your take. Off you go. So Jack went back. And as Jack went back, it was a Sunday morning, of course, like tomorrow morning. So now I'll give you a clue this. On a Sunday morning, if you want to sell anything in Bridgnorth, particularly very fresh fish straight out of the River Severn, stand outside St Leonard's Church. Because all the posh people go, and they go at 10 o'clock and they all have their church service. It's a Christian church service. This is England we're talking about. And as they're coming out, they're feeling very generous to the poor, sad-looking old man who looks like me, sat there, and they've got a whole load of fish. And they're very generous about buying the fish. And that's what they did. They bought all the fish, and Jack had a small amount of money, and off he went back to his cottage. Well, the next Saturday he was there, and the devil was there, and what happened the week before happened on that week. And at the Sunday evening, he had a pile of money. Then the third week was a bit like the second week, and the fourth week was a bit like the third week. But the pile of money was getting a little bit bigger each time. And he went, oh, he said, we've got 11 months to go. I only need one soul, but the money's beginning to arrive. Well, the second month was a bit like the third month, the first month. And the third month was a bit like the second month. And the fourth month was a bit like the third month. And on it went until it got to the 10th month, which was very much like the 9th month, but the pile of money was that much bigger. Then it got to the 11th month. And Jack was beginning to think that maybe there weren't any souls in the river this year. Then it got to the 12th month and he had to go and get his thinking hat on. Well, he sat down there and he made a straw man out of some old clothes that he had that looked just like his new clothes. And he sat down there and he made this straw man out. And he went out that day with a hat very much like John Rowe is wearing at the moment, but it was over his eyes a bit. And he'd grown a bit of a beard and he was sat there and the devil was the other side. They never spoke because the devil's not really much of a conservationist, if you know what I mean. He doesn't chat away and stuff like that. So he sat down there and at the end of that night, the devil got up and went, still no more souls. Still no more souls, you know, Jack. What are you going to do about it? Because we've got 2 left, 2 nights left. And if you haven't got 2 nights, you'll have to come to hell with me. And Jack said, a deal is a deal. A bargain struck is a bargain kept. So the one before the end, he went out in his coracle and he sat down there and he had a big floppy hat and he had his clothes down there and he didn't say very much, but certainly he was the first to look that night. He looked straight into it and he went, look, there's a soul there. And the devil looked in and he was just about to push the devil in the water and he thought he better not. And he turned round and he went, no, said the devil, there's no soul there. 1 night left. Well, Jack walked up and down. He went round and round and he went up to the pub and he went round and round and he knew what he had to do. So he got his coracle out and he put a broom pole at the back of the seat and he put the straw man in the coracle and he got a longer oar because the oars will come to about that part of your hand, but he got one that came right up underneath his arm and he sat down there and he tied it to the straw man. And just as he saw the devil was coming down, he took all his own clothes off and he jumped into the water behind the coracle. And he pushed the coracle into the water. And the devil said, I see you here on time. And Jack said, have I ever been late? No, said the devil, you've never been late, but this is the last time. If there's not a soul tonight, you have to come to hell with me. A bargain struck is a bargain kept. A proud Jack, to his word he was. So he sat down there. But just as he came up, he was in the water, and all the devil could see was this straw man with a big hat over him, and his oar going backwards and forwards. And they sat down there, just as I said, this time of year, as the sun went down, and it wasn't many hours before the sun started coming up again. And just as the sun came out, the devil turned round and he looked into the net and he said, there's no souls there at all. And you know, he is a flashy bugger sometimes, he's the devil. And there was a big crack and off the coracle went. And I must admit, there was a tiny bit of straw that came floating down. And there was a crack of lightning and there was all this smoke and the water was getting a bit misty and everything else. And Jack dipped under the water, swam upstream, hid behind a tree, looked down there 2 minutes later, and everything was gone. Well, he went back, found his clothes, went into his cottage, got himself dressed quickly, and got all the money, and decided it was best that he left. And you know something? He followed the river down. He followed the river down until he got to Gloucester. Then he turned left, and he went up some hills and past a pub that's been there for years and years called the Flying Machine, and went and settled in Cirencester. And he's been there ever since, says Jack. Well, the devil, he turned round and he went, well, he was working all day. Now, he has a funny sense of humour, does the Jack, because of the devil, because he'd stand on motorway bridges and chuck stones off. And he'd wait for the aeroplane to be full of people, and then he put something in the engine, so they had to wait for a couple of hours or so. You know? And he'd turn all the water off on washing day somewhere in the Forest of Dean and places like that. So he was doing all these things that really amuse him a little bit. But in the end, he went back for his cup of tea in hell. And he turned round there and he looked round at all the imps. And all the imps, they were sort of sweeping the mess up. And he goes, what happened here? And he said, well, we don't know. All this straw turned up and there was a floppy hat and there's a whole load of bits of stick and cotton and some tar and everything. It's made a right proper mess around here, it has. And the devil looked at it and he went, and there's a soul? And there was a complete silence. And all the imps looked at each other and went, no, there was no body. There was just a straw man and a coracle. Well, the devil, he went bananas. I don't know which faraway countries you are, but in England, when we say the devil went bananas, he got really, really cross. There was smoke coming out of his ears, and there was smoke coming out of his nose, and there was smoke coming out of every orifice you could think of. And he got his really big coracle, and he stomped off, and you could hear him walking across the Shropshire Hills. It was stomp, stomp, and he jumped in the river somewhere up by Newtown, and he stood on the coracle. And he put 1 foot one side and he won 1 foot the other side, and he got his tail out and he's using his tail to flick. And he came and he had his oar in one hand, and round the top of the coracle, there was flames coming off of it. And he was roaring his head off. And he goes, this river owes me a soul. This river owes me a soul. This river owes me a soul. And every time he came to a bridge, he gave it a great big clunk. And everybody could hear what was happening. And everybody went home to let the devil pass down through the river. As he went down through the river, it went straight down. He went down through Ironbridge. He went down through Bridge North. And he went down through Bewdley. And he went on down to Worcester. And they say that the very cathedral at Worcester itself shook to the foundations. Then he went down through Upton Road and Tewkesbury, where the Avon comes in, and he went down to Gloucester, and he went off down there, and he was still roaring his head off. I'm going to fetch a soul. I'm going to fetch a soul. Now, for those people who live round on the edge of the River Severn, there's an old poem that they tell their kids, and it's a warning, because, you know, sometimes, and I have many friends who have coracles, and who don't have coracles, who live along the river. And John, they are the most honest rogues I've ever come across in my life, but they have a coracle, and sometimes they'll go fishing sometimes. Sometimes they go fishing where they're not supposed to go fishing, like they haven't bought a license or something like that. So there's various places that if you go for a walk, and the poem goes like this. If you go for a walk late at night, and down by the river you see a strange sight, a man in a coracle with a rod and line, don't stand there or tarry or take your time, but run as fast as ever you might, for surely your soul will be in hell by the end of that night. And that is the Jack and the Coracle story. Now, I picked that up a long time ago. We're talking about back in the 80s now, and I've made a few coracles myself. And it's one of those at all. Now, I don't know, I've never done this World Storytelling Cafe before, but what I normally do is I tell a story, we have a bit of chat with the MC or something, and then I'll go and tell another one, right? So on the whole, in my lifetime, I went up to Whitby Folk Week years and years ago. Oh, John, can you hear me now?
I can hear you, and I've unmuted myself.
Right, so I used to go up to Whitby Folk Week. And one of the things that we'd do was we arranged for the storytelling. And part of the storytelling duties was to organise for people to come and things like that, John. And one of the ladies that we brought up a bit later on was a lady called Grace Holsworth. Now, Grace was the first chairman of the Society for Storytelling. Her family all came from Jamaica and was one of the, in the list of the nicest people I know, she's got to be in the top 3.
Oh, she's wonderful, isn't she?
She includes my wife and Chrissy Thomas, John. Okay. She is beautiful. But part of it wasn't part of my duties. It's something I did. She had to go to the Endeavour pub for 9:30 every morning to do the workshops. Now, the workshops, when I did the workshops, I would get about 9 or 10 people. Now, I know when Amy Douglas did the workshop, she got about 525 people. But Grace got about 18, and the workshops were Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and it's just a workshop in storytelling, John, from 10 o'clock to 11 in the morning. So I picked my truck up, and then she put all her books in it, and she was a frail old lady in them days. She's about 80 odd nowadays, and she's the only person, John, I ever took to the secret party, because you weren't allowed to take artists to the secret party, but I took Grace. Anyway, outside the Endeavour pub, which is right in the middle of Whitby, there's a pub there, and there's 2 of the biggest yellow lines you've ever seen in your life. And I used to park one side of my truck, one side of the yellow lines, and one side of my truck, the other side of the yellow lines. Go round, open the door, and Grace was there, and she'd always have loads of books. Grace lived with books, and so she'd have great big bags of books. And like I say, and I'd try and help her to get into the pub, and I'd be running backwards and forwards and getting her set up. And the landlord is an ex-RNL guy, and he's a lovely bloke, and he'd turn up and he'd make sure she had a cup of coffee and everything else. But about the 3rd morning, as I was carefully parking my car there were 2 policemen opposite. And one was the biggest Yorkshire sergeant in the police force you've ever seen. He was a mountain of a man. He was about 6'8", and he weighed about 20 stone. And as they say, that his shoulders was the size of a brick house. And you know what I mean by brick house, John Rowe. He was massive, he was. And we call him about 20 stones in our language, which is about 350 pounds, as the Americans call it, or something. Great big huge bloke. But he walked over And he took one look at the three of us and he turned round to Grace and said, would you care to lean on my arm? I'll see you into the pub. And he picked up all the books. And it took me 2 tricks to do this. He just picked the whole lot up in his left arm, picked the whole lot and put him over his shoulder. So he had Grace on one hand, had all the books on the other hand, and he looked round at me and he went, move it. And now I heard this story told about me with somebody else. And apparently, because I know I sort of straightened up a bit and almost saluted and went, yes, sir. Now, I definitely went, yes, sir, because I can remember doing it. Because what he said is, don't you know anything? These 3 stripes mean I'm a sergeant. You don't have to call me a sergeant, and you still haven't moved it. So I jumped in my truck and I moved it like you would. Now, that story I heard told in a folk song club. The person who was telling it didn't know I was there. But apparently, John, from the first time he said, move it, I straightened up and nearly saluted. 6 times of telling the version of this story, I'm now saluting and I go about 3 foot in the air. Every time.
Well, that's how a story should grow.
Yeah, well, it's certainly growing. And I can't even claim to say that it's shrinking because I've dieted a bit. I'm a bit lighter than I was, but apparently I'm heavier than I was because I'm up to 20 stone now as well as everything else. Huh? Now, right, so that's a good Shropshire story. Now I'm going to tell a few years ago. Oh, here we go, John. A few years ago, mate. Yeah,
A few years ago. Yeah.
What happened to the time?
Yesterday.
Like yesterday. Back in the 80s, I was looking around for stories like we all do, and I thought that if you were a saint in England, then there was a good chance that there was a good story behind it, because you must have been an interesting person to be a saint. And then particularly in Wales, nowadays, they have a time that they call All the Saints Times. And if you haven't seen it, there's loads of saints all over Wales nowadays. So this one I picked on years ago because I like the ending to it. And when you get to the ending to it, John, you may have heard this before, you'll know where it ends up. In this year of 2020, in the spring of 2020, it just seemed to fit in to my way of thinking. And it starts off like this. For once there was a king, and he was a good king, and he was the King of England, and he was called Henry. And he had a real good court, and he had a Mrs. King that they called Queen sometimes, and he had loads of children. But nowadays we have all these internets, and we have Zooms, and we have social media, and we have Freeview, and thousands of channels on the TV, and all the other things. But no, in them days, you had a troubadour, a poet, and a storyteller, and sometimes a bard. Well, he had what he thought was the best storyteller in the whole of England. Well, he would have done. He was the king. There were other storytellers about, but this guy, he really did like. So every evening he'd turn around, or sometimes he'd say, tell me a story, or go up to the nursery and tell the kids a story, or entertain us if you like, it's a Christmas Day or it's Easter or something like this. And this storyteller, that was his job. And he got quite well paid for it, John, which is certainly something quite rare, I've decided. So on the whole, he was living in the court, but everybody's time comes to everybody. And it was the king himself who died. And so they had a great big funeral, and the storyteller, he was a single bloke. He sat there and he looked down and he went, I don't know what I'm going to do now. My heart is broken. I love that old man. And telling stories to him was the best of all, he said. And the next king down, he went, you can stay for a bit if you like. And he said, no, I need a break. And he went to Dover and he went to Calais, and we lost track of him for a bit. We lost track of him for about 5 or 6 years. But in the end, he ended up in Grenoble. And he sat under a tree one day, and the light of Christianity came into his heart. And God spoke to him and said, I want you to cure the people. And I want you to go and learn how to be a doctor or a medical person or a wise man or a wise lady, whatever we call it nowadays and them days. I want you to go and get the knowledge so you can cure people. And the storyteller went up and he went, well, that'd take years and I've got no money. And where the hell do I do that? and there was a tap on his shoulder, and he turned around and there was a nun. And he looked at this nun, and the nun looked at her, and she said, I don't suppose your name's the storyteller, is it? He said, that was my name once. She said, well, we've been looking for you for 3 weeks. You've got to come with us. God told us. And he looked at it and said, well, God just seemed to be having the same conversation. Well, that's it. So they went to the monastery, and there was all these nuns down just on the side of the Alps there. And they had a way of curing people. They could take the plants and they could make them into drinks, or they could make oceans, ointments and flushes. And they could do all sorts of things. They could mend broken bones and things. They could take the pain away sometimes. They could get stuff from cheese that seemed to cure things and all sorts of stuff. And he learned everything. He learned everything that he could. And he also learned the way of being a man of God, a man of faith. Well, one day he said, there's nothing here for me to learn, so I'm going to leave now. And so they get a great big party, but the nuns turned around to him and said, remember this, wherever you wash up, wherever you end up, in our hospitals, it doesn't matter how rich you are, and it doesn't matter how poor you are. You can come here and you can be cured, and then you can leave again. And he said, I've got that. He said, I'm sure it would work out. I believe I'm doing God's work. And he had become a monk by then. And so he packed his little handkerchief up and he put it on his shoulder, and off he went back to Calais, and off he went back to Dover, and off he went back to his hometown, London town. And there he walked around and he noticed one thing. There wasn't a hospital anywhere in London town. There were little apothecaries. There were little shops, and there was old ladies trying to do their best for the weak and the sick and the poor. But there was no hospital. So he went straight into the king, and the king happened to be there. Now, he was another Henry. He was the second one. And he walked straight up to him and he said, Oi, he said, there's no hospital here. I want to build a hospital. And the king looked at him and went, they sound expensive. He said, what? He said, they sound expensive, hospitals. He said, they're very expensive, said our friend, the monk. He said, I want to build a hospital and you can pay for it. And the king said, well, I haven't got any money. And anyway, who the hell are you? So he told him a story. He told him a story that he'd told him when he was a little princeling up in the nursery. And he remembered the story. And he said, I remember you now. It's a long time. And I've been king here. And you can come back and be the storyteller. I loved your stories. He said, no, he said, this is what's going to happen. You aren't going to go to sleep for 3 nights. At the end of the 3rd night, you're going to give me some land and some money to build a hospital. He turned around and walked off. Well, the king, you can imagine what the king said. Well, you know, we're not going to go into the Anglo-Saxon, but we have heard that kings do swear from time to time. He said, there's nothing. That storyteller couldn't do it, but it was on his mind. And he didn't get to sleep the 1st night. And the 2nd time, to be fair, he was a good sort of Anglo-Saxon Plantagenet king. He drank so much, he just fell asleep in his chair. But he woke up in the middle of the night and he didn't know where he was. He was drunk and he didn't have any sleep. So he was facing the 3rd time. He said, go and get that storyteller. And the storyteller hadn't gone anywhere. He was just sat in the kitchen waiting. And he came back and he said, I haven't, he said, got any money, but I'll give you a bit of land where one river meets the Thames River in between the sewers and where we hang the people. It's down on the river there. Nobody else wants that land because it's smelly and it's horrible and the blood comes down there and the sewers leak and everything else. And that's all I've got, and don't ask for any more. And the only reason you're getting this is that you have to come and tell me and Mrs. King and all my children that story about the apple tree and how the pear fell off of it, which is another story for another time. And he said, okay, I'll make a deal. And they shook on it. And that night the story was told. And the next morning the monk went down to the bit of land between the sewers and when they hung the criminals, the worst land in the whole of London, apart from one bit of flat land. And there was a load of apprentices down there and they were playing football. Now this was a round ball, and you wouldn't recognize it when Arsenal go and play Tottenham from nowadays. You really wouldn't. But they were having a kick around. And it was a Saturday morning. And just as he was walking past, the centre forward kicked the ball right up in the air and it landed in front of the goalkeeper. It went straight through the goalkeeper's legs, and they scored a goal. And the monk turned round and went, "Ho, ho, ho, you must be the worst goalkeeper in the whole of England, Ireland, Wales, and Scotland." And the goalkeeper turned round with real anger in his voice. And he said, "I am," he said, "because I'm a centre forward. So if you think you can do better, why don't you come and show me?" And the monk said, "All right," he said, "I will." He was about sort of 30 in them days. What I haven't told you is he was 6'6", and he had hands the size of dinner plates. And he'd stand there, because they didn't have 45 minutes each way in them days. They had about an hour. Then they went to the pub, and then they had another hour. Then they had some tea, and they had another hour. So he was standing there, and not one time did he let the ball in. And in the end, he had made some really good new friends. And he sat down there, and they said, "Well, what are you doing?" And he said, "Well," he said, "I'm going to build a hospital." And they said, "You're going to do what?" He said, "I'm going to build a hospital." And he says, "What's one of them?" So he had to explain what a hospital was. But he also explained that it didn't matter how much money you have, and it didn't matter how rich you were or how poor you were going to come to his hospital, and you were going to be cured, and then you were going to leave again. And he went, "Right." So he started building a hospital. So all Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, he was all there by himself, and he was digging the trench out, and he was putting the foundations in, and he got a wall. Now the wall was a bit like mine. It's about 2 foot high, and it wasn't straight, and there was bits falling all over it and everything else. And that centre forward came back and looked at it and went, "What is that?" It's a Friday evening by now. So our friend the monk went, "I'll tell you what that is," he said. "That is a wall for my new hospital." And he went, "Right, not a problem at all. That's the worst wall I've ever seen. That's a terrible, terrible wall. That's not going to load a roof or anything like that. That's hopeless." And the monk turned around and went, "Well, if you can do any better, why don't you come and help me?" And he said, "Well, I happen to be an apprentice mason," he said, "and I will." So that day, they played all the football, 3 hours with the breaks and everything else. And on the Sunday morning, all the apprentices of London came back, and they started building a hospital. Now, it took them about 3 or 4 months, and it wasn't what we call a hospital. Basically, it was a room about 5 horses long and about 2 horses wide, is what they say. It had thatch on the top, had walls, and all the girls and the ladies, they came around and they saw what was happening, and they put some curtains up, and they put some straw on the bottom and all the rest of it. And they said, "Right, no problems at all. We've got a hospital." And this is what the monk said. "It doesn't matter how rich you are, and it doesn't matter how poor you are. You're going to come to our hospital, and you're going to get cured, and you can leave again. We'll find the money from somewhere else." And that's exactly what happened. Now, everybody's time comes to everybody, like I said. And eventually, that monkey died. And the people from London, they were apprentices to begin with, but now they were in the guilds themselves. So they were the guild masters. And they had always kept an eye on that hospital. And they always thought it was good. And some of them, of course, had to use it for their own families. So they went to the king, and the king could remember, and he'd seen what had happened, and he went to the Pope. And they said, "Well, what are we going to call this hospital? The monk's hospital or what?" And he said, "Why don't you call it the name he took when he became a monk? Because he took one of the 12 disciples' names, for he was known as Bartholomew." And so they called the church St. Bartholomew's Hospital. And for years and years, the London people looked after it. And it didn't matter how rich you were, and it didn't matter how poor you were looked after. And when you were well, you could leave. Now, that hospital was knocked down, and it's been rebuilt 7 times. But between now, where the sewers are and where they used to hang the old men, there's a great Victorian teaching hospital. And some of the doctors, the people I'm looking at tonight, will have been trained in that hospital, and they are famous for liver cancers. And they reckon that 90% of the time, 40 years ago, people died, and now 90% of the time, people live because of the work that they do in that particular hospital, St. Bartholomew's Hospital, the first one in England. Now, in Bristol, years and years ago, there was a guy who used to walk around and he used to sell lemonade to all the people. And he used to go around on a Sunday morning and he used to go around, and his name was Aneurin Bevan. And somewhere along their way, in a pub in the middle of Bristol, when he walked in, there was an evening, on a Sunday evening, there was a guy from the docks there, right down on the docks, and he took the lemonade into the pub and they were telling stories. And they told that story, and he was 12 years old. And if you read his autobiography, you will hear that he learnt something in the docks down in Bristol when he was a lad. And it was this: if you go to a hospital, it doesn't matter how rich you are, and it doesn't matter how poor you are, and you live in the British Isles, you'll be looked after. No one will ask you for some money. And in 1947, he created our health service, the National Health Service, on those very principles. And this spring, as we live in 2020 with the COVID stuff and everything else, I just thought it's a story I wouldn't mind telling, so you know how the NHS really got started.
That's wonderful. Mike, that's a fantastic story.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it? Yeah. Right.
And
that's really good.
Precisely
really good.
for the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those ones I picked up along the way and everything else, and it was all good fun, and I really enjoyed it, and I like telling stories like that. And the saint stories, I tell a lot, John. There's Saint Hugh of Lincoln, and Father Christmas is Saint Nicholas. You know,
Yeah,
stuff like that. Okay.
Yeah. I quite like St. Nicholas. He's done me all right as St. Nicholas.
Well, yeah. You know, it's all good fun to listen to and everything else. So I've done about how does this work? Because I'm new to this. This is my first time. I'm sorry to all the people who are listening, and thank you very much. I couldn't do this without people like you coming to listen to me, and I love doing it. That's brilliant. But I actually don't know what to do next. Do you want me to do another 15 minutes, or do you want to have a chat?
Well, I think we could have another story off you, Mike, because it's just it's taken a while to get you on here, and and I'm not going to meet you till we're not going to meet in a field for a minute, and
we're not going to drink beer in a field in England for a bit, John.
But hopefully by next July I can be round your campfire,
yes,
and running your campfire meeting, and so
we're going to at the festival. We're going to have two campfires. We're going to have a sacred fire, and you have to pass the relevant sort of learning to do that. And we've got a couple of people who have volunteered to do that. And so we'll have the sacred fire meetings, which we think are really important. And the open fire, which is the one you've kindly said that you will keep an eye on for me, where it's a bit like this, but live.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, that sounds good. I'm really actually looking forward to that. That's
yeah.
It's well, I think we all are. Amy, Trudy down in Texas. We're all looking forward to.
Well, I want you all to come.
To going out and doing a bit of live storytelling again.
Well, absolutely, Trudy. We have someone called Dan Kedding. He lives up in Chicago, and I stayed in his house, and he's coming over all the way from the United States. And Sheila Arnold is on my hit list. Whether we can get her the first year or not, I don't know. She is definitely on my hit list to come on over. Right. So,
well, we'd love another one off you, Mike, before you go, because.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. You go to. I'll do this one and another couple, and we'll see where we are. But you go to Bromyard, don't you?
I do.
Bromyard Folk Festival. Now, Bromyard is a small little town on the Welsh Marsh, and goes the first folk festival I ever went to is in the 1970s, and we got Fred Jordan was there, and a pal of mine used to run it called Dave Jones. But as I left one day, and it was just as my first daughter, here we go again, John. It's all right, John and I do this a lot when we meet. Anna's 40 now, and she was in the womb the second year. So the first year, she hadn't even turned up yet. It was that long ago, right? And so just as I left, that my dad turned around and went, if you go to the churchyard in Bromyard, there's a fantastic old church there that goes back to the Normans and the Saxons and all that. in the churchyard, there's a stone, there's a church stone, a marker. And on it, it says this: take time for a fart wherever you be, for a want of a fart was the death of me. Go and see if you can find it. So I came back
next year.
Yeah, you go and have a look, right? You listen, right? So Dad came back and he saw a couple of weeks later, we were drinking cider, watching cricket up in Worcestershire under Elmley Castle. And he said, did you find the churchyard? And I went, the church stone, the gravestone. And I went, no, I didn't have time, funny enough. And he went, oh, try next year, you see, because I know it doesn't exist. I know it's not there. And I know that he wants me to go and have a look. And then he can say, gotcha, right? So I said, so since then, this is 1970, I didn't know. Well, he passed away in 2003, and he didn't mention it at all from about the 90s onwards, because he caught on and everything else. But I live in a little village called Cardington, and Cardington is quite a posh little village. But someone who lived in Geneva, and he was an engineer, wanted to bring his children up in England, and his lady comes from Belfast. So they bought a house, and she'd come over to explore the village. And it's 7 o'clock in the evening now, John. And these kids have been flown in from Geneva, found a new home, and we're all excited. And we're running around the pub, left, right, and centre, screeching their heads off, which can upset old gits like me who sat in the corner with our half pints of beer, wanting a nice peaceful evening. So I turned around to these two youngsters who were about 8 and 10 and said, I will buy you an ice cream each, because someone's gone and moved the headstone, and I don't know where it is. And on the headstone, it says, take time for that. And off these two kids, well, the mother was looking at me. Now she's, ultra 21st century, geared up to everything from Belfast. So you're not going to get any flies on her, like. And she turned around and off the kids go, and they've gone for an hour. And they look at every headstone that you can think of, and they come back and they come down and they go, Mum, we can't find the headstone. Of course, the pub's been completely quiet by all then. And the landlord said, never mind, here's an ice cream each. And he gives the kids an ice cream. And the mother turns around to me and said, that worked really well. She said, where'd you get that story from? And said, well, I didn't get it from anywhere, but my father gave it to me when I didn't want it. Was the answer. So there's that one. And there's another gravestone story, and it's up in Herefordshire, and it goes from Hereford, and it's now in the middle of a council house estate. So there's a big roundabout, and there's a big white cross on the roundabout. And as you leave Hereford to go up the Golden Valley, you're leaving good Christian country to go to the pagan Welsh. And so the monks put a big white cross up in there. And if you're coming in the other direction, if you're coming from the pagan Welsh and you're walking down into Hereford, so you see the big white cross, and you're leaving pagan Wales to come in to the good Christian place of Hereford. So that's why the big white cross is there. Now, there's lots of stories about the graveyards and the gravestones that go from there up through the Golden Valley, up into Kington and to Knighton, and just before you get up to the Welsh border there. And there's this one which I think is really, really sad, because there's a stream. There's not many streams that go down through graveyards, because you think about it, it's to do with the water levels and everything else. You dig a hole and alongside the stream, it's going to fill up with water. But up in this part, just as you go up into the Welsh mountains, the land drops quite steeply, and there's this stream that tumbles through. And on the side of the stream, there's a headstone of a ship's captain. And on the ship's captain, it goes da 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 da. It was at Trafalgar, da da da. Wanted to be on the side, buried where he could hear the bubbling of a brook or the tides and the waves of the sea. And so they put his headstone alongside the brook. And on the other side of the brook, there's another headstone, exactly opposite to it. And on there, it's his wife. And on her headstone, it says, I am the wife of Vice Admiral, da 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 da. I wanted to be this side of the stream because water separated us in life, and now it will separate us in death. So there's the two headstones either side of the stream. But when they came to dig her, that went straight onto granite. Now, these are Herefordians, and they're only getting paid too much. It would have taken them a week to dig the grave down to make it safe. So they had a bit of a whizzo idea. So they put the gravestone there, but they buried her on top of him on the other side of the stream, because that would be easier digging. And so what you have is the two gravestones that tell the stories that I've just told to you, but in reality, they're both buried in the same hole. So they will both be together for eternity. And when I was taken there by a really old storyteller, and he said, have a look at this, Mike, I just sat down there and I thought it was a lovely little tale of two people. And when you look back into it, those times, he was at Trafalgar and he saved us. You know, we hear a lot about the Battle of Britain and stuff, but Trafalgar was a big enough battle in its own right in them days, John. And he was there and he fought for us. And the people keep his grave up. The people of the churchyard there will keep his grave up. And I thought that was a lovely little story. And those are the sort of stories I started with. Back in the 70s and the 80s, I'd be driving around and I'd be out with the Morris teams. And I'd tell a story. One of the stories I told with Bartholomew, I used to tell stories in those days in the Morris kits. And the people would come along and they'd say, do you know this story? And even if I did, I always said, well, I don't know your version anyway. And we'd sit and we'd start collecting stories. And that's how it was for me, which is why I've got no books. I've got no videos. I've got nothing, all the other things which I have not got. But I have got an awful lot of stories, which I tell from time to time. And that's how it works for me. So
well, what's wonderful about listening to you, Mike, is that it's like sitting across a table to someone. And, right. You know, and when I was a kid, you know, one of the things I used to love was when the old boys would come round and you'd be there and it really, you got carried away with what they were saying, and they always had great life stories and bits and pieces, and I used to be fascinated by that. And you know, yeah. I've never wanted to go home. And you know, and Mike, you took me right back to that place where, you know, where you're just sitting listening to a really fascinating series of stories that come across as a conversation. And as you know, it's kind of really an important part of storytelling that we, you know, that there's not one, you know, I'm not one of those people that says one bit's real and this bit's real and that bit's not. You know, it's all real. You know, it's a broad church. But yeah,
I do think you have to be a storyteller. Call yourself a storyteller. Yeah, you have to do a little bit of everything. So you have to be prepared to stand. The biggest one I ever did was in America. It's about 3,000 people or something along those lines. And the smallest one I've done, well, you know, we have a storytelling club that's been going 30 years and there's been 5 or 6 people there. And no one gets paid and no one pays to come in, and we all just sit around and we all just tell stories once a month in a pub. And then it's got a log fire and things like that. But I was called a bard once, John, which I was very proud about, because
that is indeed a compliment.
Yeah, well, I thought so, because the landlord of the George and Dragon in Muchwanglock said, "You bard." And I went, "That's a real compliment. Thank you very much. William Shakespeare was a bard." And he said, "Yeah, you're bard." And I thought, "Yeah, thank you very much. Would you care to write it down for me? I'm going to put that on all my publicity and everything else." I won't tell you what he said next.
Well, Mike, I mean, is anyone, you know, Mike has got this, you know, it's that, and I'm with totally, you know, that bit of you can work to thousands, or you can sit on the bonnet of a car and tell a story, and you know, and it's whatever it is, it's, you know, it's what we do. We have to do that range, and. But has anyone else got any questions for Mike while we've got him in the room before he escapes?
I doubt very much. One of the best things at Whitby is that we do a sea walk. We make it free. It goes from the bandstand in the harbour and you follow the coast path round to Sands End, and you have a couple of pints in a pub and you get a bus back into Whitby town, and it takes about 2 hours. And it's one of my favourite times, is doing that kind of stuff. And you can get people who are more relaxed And our greatest storytellers have been there and done that. Now, Amy Douglas, I see, is here. She's done that loads of times. And Xanthi Gresham and people like that, when they come up all nervous because they haven't been there before, and you put them on the stage and they almost relax because they wonder what a folk festival is. By the time that comes round on the Thursday evening and the Thursday afternoon, they absolutely, and I say, can I come back? I'll come back. You know, tell me what I've got to do to come back, and all the rest of it. But some of the concerts can be really quite challenging, and you have to learn your trade. But you can sit there with the Duncan Williams and the Stanley Robinsons and the things like that, and you sit outside the cafe and you have a chance to talk about it all, because a storyteller's life can be quite lonely, I think, sometimes, John. You know, you go off to school and you come back again, and you go and do that work, and you come back again and you do that, and it is the life of a troubadour. And I never wanted. Well, I went over to the west coast of Ireland and with Packy Byrne and Eddie Lenihan and all those over there. And you finish a school at 4 o'clock. And the only thing I had to do was decide when I was going to have my couple of 3 pints of Guinness, well, I was going to have them early and go to bed at 10 o'clock, or I was going to do some research and go and have them at 9 o'clock and go to bed at 10 o'clock to the school next door. And I had a wife and 2 children at the time. And I didn't want to spend my life like that. I wanted to be back in Shropshire with the family. So I was never one for really roaming around. I went over to the States because I was curious, and they offered me money for it and 1 or 2 other things. And I've been pretty much some parts of Europe, and I've been all over the UK, apart from Orkney and Shetland and Kent for some reason. I don't seem to be in Kent very much, but I've been pretty much everywhere else. And this is my life, and that's how it's been for me, and I've been happy with that. And,
well, it's been lovely to have you on, Mike. I mean, it really, you know, and for I know there's lots of people outside the dozen in this room. You know, they're outside the door, listening in. So thank you, Mike. It's been
it's been, and thank you for asking me, John. I do appreciate it. And like I always say, I can't do this, and there's people like I'm looking at are here to listen to it, and the listeners are far more important than all the storytellers. So thank you for sitting there.
That's Taffy's line, isn't it? If speaking was more important, we'd have 2 mouths and 1 ear or something.
No, John, did I tell him that, or did he tell that to me?
Well, I'm all when I'm referring to someone of a certain vintage, I'm always nervous about saying that, because saying things like that, because you'll all claim to have said it to the other. I actually
think
we all listen to people coming out with stories that we actually you know, in a pub, and they go, "Do you know this?" And I was thinking, "Yeah, I do actually. I told you that." But you don't say it, do you? Just because it's always nice the way it comes out.
I think it came out of a fellow called Fred Jordan when we all sat outside the hot pole in Bromyard one afternoon. But Taffy seems to have a bit of a memory not like mine, because he was thinking about it, but he wasn't saying it when this subject came up last. So we always argue about who's got the best side, Hereford or Somerset. So with Taffy.
Well, anyway, thank you very much, Mike. It's been brilliant.
Okay. Is that it? Is anybody else? Right, what happens now? I'm going to have a beer.
We'll give you a round of applause in the traditional manner.
All right.
And thank you, and we hope you relax and have a beer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hussein, for saying that.
Thank
I'd like
you.
to see Amy. I can see you now. Thank you. Hello, Amy. Nice to see you.
Thank you. We'll get your hat sorted out.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Right, Stephanie, I nearly got Cirencester in there. Did you notice?
You did, but
yes.
I actually grew up in Gloucester. I was in Stonehouse, and so we were always down by Frampton and everywhere like that. So we know the River Severn very, very well. Been swimming there many times when we shouldn't have been.
Well, I was down on the docks on Wednesday.
We could have been one of the souls.
Yeah.
Oh, were you?
I was down in the docks on Wednesday with my auntie Hilary, who's 91, and it's the first time she'd been let out since all this. So we went down on the docks. Yeah, and I can remember taking a boat in there and all sorts. Amy was on the boat when we did that. The tall ships came in, and we took we got a little boat in them days up in Pershore, so we came down to Tewkesbury and on down. So it was all I
lived in Hampstead, just well, since they've developed it since.
Yeah.
So I lived in Hampstead and worked in Hampstead for many, many years. But I had my wedding was the reception was on the River Severn.
Brilliant.
So we had the King Arthur at the Gloucester
Yes.
docks,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
we went down the canal for the wedding afternoon to open up all the bridges because we were fed up with them closing
Yeah.
every time we needed to get out of Hampstead. And then we went up the River Severn and we had a barn dance on the King Arthur boat on the River Severn in the evening.
Oh, that sounds like a lovely evening. That really does. Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was good.
Yeah.
I knew it well. You should
Yeah.
come for dinner with me and John next time you're down.
Love
When
to.
it's safe.
Yeah, love to.
Brilliant.
Absolutely. My grandparents both lived on Tuffney Avenue.
Oh, right.
If you know Tuffney
So did
Avenue.
I.
Yeah.
Yes. So did
One
I.
at the top and one at the bottom. Right. Yeah. To this day. And we are getting we're finished now. We're getting to talk about Tuffney Avenue in Gloucester. We're going to start talking about the pubs like the British flag or something.
Well, that's one of the things about the end of this session. It's a bit like going to the bar and having a drink. Except with you, Mike, we never left it. Thank you very much, Mike.
Well done,
Thank you.
John. Thank you. Bye bye.